If you're putting in the miles but still seeing little progress and you're constantly feeling drained, you're not alone. The missing piece is probably your refueling. On October 8th from 12 to 1 p.m. Central, I invite you to join Between the Miles, Strategic Refueling for Endurance Athletes. In this online masterclass, I will show you how to fuel smarter outside of your workouts so you can accelerate recovery, shake off that lingering fatigue, and finally maximize your performance gains without adding stress to your already busy life. I'm sharing practical strategies for setting macronutrient targets and fueling on rest days. You'll also see real-life athlete case studies and discover meal and snack ideas you can implement immediately. Registration is only $25, and if you can't make it live, no worries. It's recorded, and you'll get lifetime access to the replay. Head to the link in the show notes to get registered today, and let's get you fueling in a way that truly supports the training you love. I'm Alex Larson, dietitian, Ironman finisher, and host of Endurance Eats, the podcast where we break down the science of endurance nutrition and turn it into clear, practical nutrition advice to revolutionize how you think about fueling your body. So grab a seat, or keep moving if you're out training, and let's get started. Welcome back to Endurance Eats, the podcast where we don't just talk fueling strategies, we talk about the real shit. Literally, because if you've ever sprinted towards a porta potty mid-run, this episode is for you. Let's be honest, endurance sports aren't just about watts, splits, and VO2 max. They're also about diarrhea at mile 12 and a mid-ride nature break in spandex and that wave of nausea that makes you wonder why the hell you signed up for the race in the first place. GI distress? Yeah, it's that clingy, unwanted training partner that shows up at the worst times. Which is why I'm being joined by Dr. Patrick Wilson, an associate professor of exercise science at Old Dominion University, where he directs the Human Performance Laboratory. He's published over 80 peer-reviewed scientific articles on nutrition, exercise, and health, and in 2020, he literally wrote the book on this topic, The Athlete's Gut. Today, we're diving into why the gut goes rogue in endurance sports, how to prevent a mid-race meltdown, and what the science actually says about fueling without feeling like you're auditioning for an Imodium commercial. All right. Let's get into this. Patrick, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the podcast. This is going to be a fun discussion because I think it's one that we see happening to a lot of endurance athletes, myself included. I think all of us at some point have some sort of horror story of GI problems mid-workout or mid-race. So I'm just curious, Patrick, to get us really kicked off, in your research, like how common are GI issues in endurance athletes?
Yeah, it's one of those questions that you're going to get an answer from me that's pretty common, and it depends. And it really varies based on the athlete you're looking at. But more importantly than that, it's kind of the intensity of the exercise, duration of exercise, environmental conditions. All those things are going to play a role in how common and how frequent and severe those gut problems tend to be. I would say on the extreme end of the spectrum, if you look at like an ultra marathon, you can get over 90% of athletes reporting gut problems during the course of the race. Now, the majority of those are not severe to the point where they're going to have to stop, but a substantial number are. In that example of ultra race, like for the Western States, in some historical years of that race where they've done some research, it's one of the leading causes of dropout. I'm not quite sure if that's still the case now, but at least historically, that's been a major reason why some of those athletes end up dropping out of the race. For shorter races and events and training that's less intense, a lot less likely you're going to have severe problems, but you still have a percentage of athletes that have some level of gastrointestinal symptoms. I mean, you obviously you can ask people to rate on like a 0 to 10, do you have X symptom? And a lot of people are going to rate a 1 to 2, a low number. It doesn't mean that they've got really any problems, but nonetheless, there's a smaller percentage of people who do have more moderate to severe symptoms. So in the context of like an ultra race, it can be quite high. In like a half marathon or a 10K or something like that, or a professional bike race, it's generally going to be a lot lower in terms of the number of athletes that have a major problem. Maybe 5-10% on a given occasion, event, race are going to have a more major problem.
Yeah. And even in those shorter events, it might be more of along the lines of like having to hit up the porta potty mid-race. It's not going to take you out of the race, but it's definitely going to impact finish time and performance that way. But I would agree, like those longer ultra distance races, things can go south pretty severely and they can prevent people from finishing, which is not ideal because there's a lot of training that goes into prepping for those races and for that to take you out really sucks.
And even beyond that, just like the enjoying the experience, like you want to generally feel good when you do these things, whether it's a race or even training. I mean, nobody really likes to experience these problems. So even if it's just a matter of improving the way that you feel during most of your training sessions, that's still something to be, I think interested in.
Yeah. In my experience working with endurance athletes, I find that GI issues can be very, very highly individualized. And I appreciate you like starting out your answer with it depends. I feel like my team and I, anytime we're like answering questions, we're like, oh, it depends. Like, 'cause there's so many like variables that depend on the individual. So how does one go about researching GI issues in athletes? And what are the biggest themes that you've seen in terms of what's causing them to happen during exercise?
Yeah, and you're right that they're highly individual. If you look at studies that try and predict the severity of gastrointestinal symptoms, for example, you get usually pretty small correlations with any single variable. So it's rarely the case that it's just one thing that is causing somebody's issues. Now, it does happen, like if you slam a giant energy drink or something with massive amounts of caffeine before your race, like that's a pretty isolated thing that can contribute to problems, or if you make a really bad mistake in terms of your in-race nutrition or something like that. But in many cases it's kind of a combination of things, from potentially nutrition to somebody's just background anatomy and physiology, kind of their psychological state or mood states, environmental conditions, and then again, the intensity and duration of what they're doing. What I typically would recommend for somebody is to think about what are the actual specific symptoms you're experiencing, ranging from nausea, vomiting, reflux, fullness, bloating, side stitching, abdominal cramps, bloating, urges to have to use the restroom, gas. And each of those things can kind of maybe point you into the direction of what the underlying cause is. Because some of the things that cause nausea, for example, tend to be a bit different from what's going to cause, excess gas or intestinal cramping. So thinking about what are the common symptoms you're experiencing, and then when are you experiencing them? Is it day to day plus your exercise and training, or is it isolated just to kind of when you exercise? Because depending on the answer to that, it may guide the person or the practitioner to specific causes as being more plausible than others. So yeah, you're right. It is very individual. It's hard to generalize to everybody because there are 10 different symptoms, or if not more than that you can kind of experience, and the underlying causes may slightly vary. So I think thinking about the context of when you're experiencing those symptoms and then what they are can at least start to allow someone to potentially figure out really what the underlying cause or causes would be involved.
Okay, so you listed a few different like trends of reasons why someone would have GI issues. I think you mentioned like environmental conditions. I certainly find for myself that when I live in northern Minnesota, which you are from, and what's crazy is you and I were around the same age and we both did track, and I'm pretty sure you and I were at the same track meets as kids.
Probably.
Wild to me. Such a small world. But like in northern Minnesota, and I run all year round, I never have GI issues in the winter. Like I actually have grown to like love running like fall, winter, spring. And then as soon as we get that heat wave in June, it's like I have to make sure I have like a port of stop like 2-3 miles in, like because that heat just like wreaks havoc. So can we talk about environmental conditions and why that exacerbates GI issues so much?
Yeah, and certainly temperature and humidity are big players. We can also think about like altitude as well can be involved. It's just it's a stressor on the body. You think about heat especially as a stressor because it is sort of making your body really make decisions about how it's going to allocate resources. So during exercise, your priority generally is to try and make sure you're supplying oxygen and nutrients in a sufficient amount to your muscles so that they can kind of continue to work at the rate that you've been working at. Or you want to work at. And in the condition of being hot and humid, right, that's going to challenge your body's thermoregulation. You're going to have a harder time dissipating heat through some of the typical mechanisms. So you typically sweat more as a way to compensate for that. Sweat in the evaporation of sweat is going to be a way for your body to deal with that thermal load. And that means also that a lot of your blood volume that typically is devoted to your muscle and then to your gut ends up being redistributed to the skin because it's closer to your body's shell. That warm blood can more easily dissipate heat off your body, plus the need for sweating. It's a kind of a competition for resources. So there's studies that clearly show that when you make people hot or when you make them dehydrated or a combination of both, you tend to have higher prevalence and severity of most gastrointestinal symptoms because you're getting less blood flow, less oxygen flow to the gut. Plus, there's these hormones that your body tends to release in larger quantities under stressful conditions that may also kind of exacerbate some of those gastrointestinal motility issues, maybe delay of stomach emptying, and then you increase the permeability of your gut as well can happen under stressful conditions. And all that is kind of a mixture that leads to poor function plus the symptoms that associate with that, whether that be nausea, vomiting, reflux, bloating, feeling like nothing's emptying from your stomach, for example. One way to potentially deal with that is obviously to acclimate to your environment. And as people get more accustomed to the heat and humidity, they should generally tend to expect to have fewer of those problems, but they're not necessarily going to go away completely. So that's one approach, obviously, to help maybe deal with some of those issues, is just realize that you need to acclimate to that heat and humidity, altitude as well, when you go up to altitude, before you can start to expect some of those symptoms to maybe dissipate in terms of their severity.
Yeah, one thing that I have found when my athletes have a race coming up and it's like going to be unseasonably hot and or humid, I tell them, hey, we got to lower our expectations a little bit about performance here. I might shift their fueling and nutrition to really prioritizing hydration so they don't get dehydrated, but also then doing a little bit more liquid-based carbs like in with their fluids, because some of those more solid fuels that they may have used previously I'm like, those are just going to take longer to digest and they're going to sit in your stomach longer and you're more likely to have an upset GI problems during that. Would you say that that's probably where you would typically go to with that type of recommendation in terms like setting yourself up for success in those types of like tough race conditions?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, those would be the things that I would tell an athlete would be number one, adjust your expectations in terms of how you're going to perform. Unless you've done a crazy amount of heat training, even then it's you're not generally fully going to be able to perform at your max as compared to temperate conditions. So adjust those expectations, adjust your pacing accordingly. And then realizing, like you said, that as compared to a cooler environment, your sweat rate is going to be a lot higher. You want to account for that in your hydration plan, in your nutrition plan. At the same time, you don't want to, I think, overdo hydration without being accustomed to that. So, getting your athletes to maybe practice this in their training while they are kind of experiencing those larger sweat rates, so they actually kind of have a sense of what that's going to feel like if they do try and up their fluid intake. And then just be aware of what your sweat rate is across a range of intensities and environmental conditions, especially for the longest events, things that last more than a few hours. I think it's really important to know what your sweat rates are, generally speaking, under those different intensities and environmental conditions. Whereas an event that's less than 2 hours, I mean, it might make a difference, but there just isn't enough time in those events to accumulate huge fluid losses and dehydration unless you start out sort of underhydrated. So the priority would be in those cases where, it is really sustained long competition that's more than a few hours, where knowing that sweat rate and trying to not completely match it, but drink enough that you're preventing major dehydration over the course of that competition or event.
I would say what gets tough is for us in like the Northern Hemisphere, when we go down, like I had a triathlete that lives in Maine. She did like Ironman Chattanooga 70.3 in the spring, where I'm like, oh yeah, you're going to like the heat. So I'm like, I need you to stay on top of drinking your bottles on the bike. We really need to prioritize hydration, even though you're not going to feel like it in your cooler temps up in Maine. And was able to go into Chattanooga just like rocking her hydration and finished really strong. Like anticipating that and doing your homework. And when we say do your homework, it's not just like complete your training plan. It's like learn what your sweat rate is, practice your hydration so that you can go into that race and be able to execute and feel really good.
Yeah, and it doesn't require a ton of extra time and effort to get a sense of what your sweat rate is under different conditions. I mean, if it's an hour or two of training, just make sure to measure your body weight before and afterwards, and then account for what you drank. And you can get, at least a reasonable approximation of what your sweat rate is. And again, not to necessarily fully replace that, but, half to 2/3 of it, for example. I mean, that's a reasonable goal for most scenarios. I don't know that for most athletes, you need to get way more technical than that. But yeah, I think, like you said, doing a little bit of homework and having an understanding of how your body functions under different conditions.
All right. What were the other? You said psychological was another one that you had mentioned. Let's talk about that, because I am definitely one where I'm like nerves just wreak havoc on I mean, especially before an event, I get pretty like amped up and nervous, and I notice like before the race. Talk to me about like the psychological impact on GI distress during exercise.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I get a fair amount of, especially like anticipation anxiety, whether it's with races, whether it's with talks, whether it's things like that. So I always notice myself, you kind of have that. For me, it's like bloating and almost like you just feel like your gut or your stomach isn't functioning optimally. It's funny, my son will sometimes say, like when my wife and I ask him to do chores around the house, he's 7. So we're not asking him to do anything crazy, but he'll say, my stomach hurts because he's stressed about the chores or if he's trying to like pull one over on us. But even at 7 years old, when he gets stressed out, he's articulating that his stomach is bothering him.
Yeah.
So, all of us, I think, have some experience with that to varying degrees. And there's physiology behind that. And when you are stressed psychologically, your body produces a variety of hormones. A corticotropin releasing hormone or factor from the hypothalamus is a primary one that's involved. That leads to a variety of different downstream effects. It can cause release of stress hormones from the pituitary and in the adrenal glands. And then directly, even in the intestinal tissues, there's receptors there for CRH or CRF that when it binds to those receptors can cause, changes in motility, changes in function and permeability. So there's definitely a physiology that's involved there. Ultimately, stress is something and anxiety is something that each athlete is going to respond to differently. Very, very individual. I would say it's sort of like a quarter or a third of athletes tend to kind of have more of this high anxiety response that tend to deal more with these sort of gut associated problems. Whereas others, it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. So for those that do have more of that kind of gut anxiety stress connection, there's a number of things that hypothetically they could do. It could be slow deep breathing. It can be things like cognitive behavior therapy, mindfulness. Now, there's not a lot of direct evidence in athletes that those things work, but there's not a lot of risk in most cases. And it's just because the studies haven't been done looking at whether or not those interventions in athletic populations reduce gastrointestinal symptoms that kind of accompany anxiety and stress. But they're relatively low risk. Beyond that, the other thing I would say is nutritional wise, there are some things to do or look at that may heighten or lower the stress response, like caffeine ingestion, other supplements that sometimes athletes are overdoing because they hear that they're good for performance without really thinking through on race day or competition day. You already kind of are amped up and you may not, at least beforehand, need quite as much of a stimulant as you would during a regular training session where you're kind of not stressed psychologically and the effects of that might not be so pronounced in terms of the negatives. So yeah, I think it's a combination potentially of looking at some psychological interventions plus looking at some nutritional things that may have an effect on stress response, caffeine being one example.
Okay, let's talk about the nutrition piece of it, though. Is there things that athletes should look at, like nutritionally? Because I feel like when an athlete has like GI issues, they automatically blame like, oh, that gel didn't sit with me, or this fuel product, oh, is terrible. Like, what are some themes that you see in terms of like types of fueling, maybe eating before or around that workout that you see can commonly be culprits to causing issues?
Yeah, I think it's a variety of things. Beforehand, it may be eating too close or too much or the wrong type of food in proximity to when they're working out. And I make this mistake even myself nowadays. Yeah. There was like a couple months ago, I was going to do an interval workout and we had a departmental meeting at a restaurant and I ordered like the chicken salad sandwich that was just massive. And like, there's a fair amount of fat in that. I ate it. Like, I should have enough time before my workout, 2.5 hours later for this to be out of my stomach. And then the first 4 miles were pretty uncomfortable. I ended up doing the workout, but I had to have an extended warm up because like it was just sitting like a brick in my stomach. And I wrote a book on this and I still am making the same mistakes.
Yeah, we're both dietitians, but we are 100% human, even though this is our area of expertise. Yeah.
I still do dumb stuff all the time, maybe less so than, inexperienced athletes, but I'm still guilty of making those types of mistakes.
We just know better. And then we're like, oh shoot, like I totally made
yeah. So there's that piece of it. So anything that is going to slow down emptying from the stomach, whether it be fat or solid protein or fiber, not to avoid it, but, minimize the amount and then be aware of how much time you have in between when you're eating that and then when you're exercising. I don't think it's necessary to completely avoid those nutrients. I think that's probably overkill in most cases, unless you're super sensitive. And you want to obviously include those things in your diet on a regular basis. So, whether it be fiber or obviously sufficient protein and healthy fats. Too much caffeine sometimes, I think sometimes people aren't really aware of how much caffeine they're consuming, and it can accumulate over the course of the day. And sometimes it's almost like you don't understand why your stomach feels sort of upset, or why you're kind of having more sort of seemingly urges to have to use the bathroom. So that's one, at least, to look at the quantity of caffeine that you're consuming, especially when combined with any stressful situations that you're going to be training or competing under, where those kind of act synergistically to maybe cause more severe problems for your gut. So those are some of the major ones. During exercise, like carbohydrate intake, I think, there's so many products out there nowadays. And I think what happens a lot of times is somebody just has a bad day, bad experience. They look at what they ate and they say, well, I'm not using that product anymore. And it may or may not have really been that product in terms of the issue. It could be any number of things that really cause the issue. But if you're repeatedly experiencing issues with a given product, then that gives you, I think, sufficient reason to change and try something else. I think sports nutrition products have gotten a lot better in the last 10, 15 years. When I first started using gels, some of them very like sticky and almost like I would not choke on them, but to get them down without any extra fluid, it was very difficult, especially at high intensity.
It's like almost like a toothpaste consistency.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah. And that's when, like, for me, 11 years ago was Ironman Wisconsin, and all there really was goos, and Honey Stinger was just kind of coming out, but there wasn't a lot of options like there is now. And now all I use hardly, or for the most part, is gels. So they've come so far, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and I go for ones that tend to have a little bit more of a liquid consistency, in part because they just go down a bit easier for me, and I don't feel like they get stuck in my throat or my esophagus. So I think that part of it is just a lot of the products have gotten better. And then there's the makeup of what's in there, obviously. The best evidence is probably for the sort of maltodextrin / glucose fructose mixtures. There's obviously hydrogels. The scientific evidence on those is not overwhelming by any means. In terms of the carbohydrate supplements, the bicarb products are a little bit different in terms of the evidence. But for the actual just straight up gels, they don't have a disadvantage, or they're not, I wouldn't say, going to cause you more issues, but do they actually eliminate or reduce gastrointestinal problems? Most studies have said no. There's one that suggested yes, but it's a bit unique in terms of what they did. I think it's still up for debate whether or not those hydrogel products really actually have a substantial impact on gastrointestinal symptoms. There's also just the form of liquid versus gel versus solid. Anecdotally, plus some evidence from a few studies, is that when you pick a solid food, it may raise the risk of some gastrointestinal symptoms. Not massive differences in the studies that have been done, but if you kind of extrapolate that to, let's say, a very hot and humid day, a 5-hour stage race or something like that, a cyclist is at the end of their, close to the end of their stage or the race, you probably want to go with the option that's a little bit less risky in terms of causing gastrointestinal problems. And that might be a liquid or a gel.
I find a lot of athletes are using like candy, like Nerds clusters are hugely popular right now. And I think those are great, but also like the volume that you have to consume in order to get enough carbs in is really challenging. So I think it's important also to look at like, okay, how can I easily get in the most bang for my buck that's going to reduce my risk of GI issues as much as possible?
Yeah. And for me, gels tend to be the way that I do that. So I would, agree. There's practical things that people have recommended or studies have looked at, like potatoes and bananas, and those are fine and great. And I think under certain circumstances, they're completely usable and, appropriate, an ultra race where you're not exercising at that high of an intensity and you just want something solid and you want change the flavor or the texture. Nowadays, I think ultra races have gotten so fast at the high end that it's even getting difficult sometimes to do some of those things in any really meaningful amounts because of the intensities that they're being sort of finished at these days.
Well, let's talk about ultra and longer distance races, because I did get a question from someone on Instagram that said, like, what do I do when I'm like in the middle of my ultra distance race and things start to go south? Is there anything that I can do to like make the issues go away? And obviously the answer I know is it depends, but like, I'm like, okay, I guess for me, if I was having issues mid ultra distance race, I would first get curious in terms of like, okay, where am I at hydration wise? Have I peed in a while? Like, am I dehydrated? That's probably where I would first look. Am I like bonking? Am I like having some sort of like stress response because I'm underfueled? Like for me, those are the first couple of things, but I guess what comes to mind for you, like what happens at that point?
Yeah, it's a good question. And whether it's pretty difficult to correct mid-race and figure out like what's happening and what the cause is. Sometimes it might be kind of obvious if you had a plan to ingest, 60 to 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate, but you've really only been hitting 45 or 50. That might be a sign that you really kind of underdone it and you're starting to get some of those symptoms that might, like nausea, for example, or lightheadedness could be an indicator that you're under consuming carbohydrate. In that scenario, it's fairly easy to figure out, yeah, I probably need to up my intake here to reduce these issues. Alternatively, if like you were planning to ingest 90 grams or something an hour and the conditions are maybe a little bit hotter or more stressful than what you're used to, and things are starting to kind of feel like they're not emptying from your stomach, at that point, maybe you need to really back off and adjust your race plan, because under those stressful conditions, maybe you're just not accustomed to ingesting that amount. But it takes recognition to understand in the moment that that might be what's going on. And then also try and figure out really if that's the actual underlying issue, which is difficult. I think for ultras, it's particularly difficult because the longer you get into those races, the rate of nausea goes up substantially. And why that happens is still not fully understood. I think if someone had a good, honest solution to preventing that, they would have already done it, and it would not be a non-issue, but it's not a non-issue. So I think looking at what you did over the course of your races, thinking about your overall nutrition plan, and identifying the most likely suspects or the most likely causes of those issues, I think is at least something you can tinker with, but it doesn't guarantee that it's going to fix the problem. To some extent, it might have to do with the combination of hormones, breakdown products, other things in your bloodstream that are kind of activating the sort of the nausea center in your brain, the vomiting center that signals you've got this urge to have to kind of throw up, right? And there's not necessarily clear nutrition choices that are going to prevent that. So I think the athletes do the best they can to have a game plan, but you even hear winners of ultra races, high profile athletes saying, yeah, I had nausea, I threw up, and then I kept going and I finished the race that way. I think part of it is accepting that that might be an occurrence that you just have to deal with and adjust accordingly. So that one's, I think, of the questions I've gotten many times over the years, the most difficult to say that this is the most likely thing going on, because it's not really well understood what the physiology is for why nausea becomes so prevalent in ultra races.
Yeah. I find for my Ironman athletes, especially during that run, like that marathon run, I kind of warn them. I'm like, hey, halfway point of the run, like your gut just might start to feel a little off. Don't panic. I don't think it was anything that you did. I think it's just the stress of the day and it's going to feel a little funky. And I don't know why, but so many people report that the flat Coke that's offered during the run, like brings them back to life. Like it settles their stomach and perks them back up with that caffeine. Is there any validity to that? Like that like flat Coke with the caffeine and sugar boost?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to think through what would be the mechanism or physiology behind that that's different from any other carbohydrate containing.
So many triathletes are like, oh, I can't wait for that flat Coke. Like it just like does something for them. And I don't know if it's just that caffeine boost or it's not like there's a ton of caffeine in Coke. Like there's some, I don't know, or just the acidity of it gives them a little different flavor profile, that bite. But yeah, that one's always like, I don't know why it does it, but if it works, great. And keep doing it. And
that's really what you end up having to tell most athletes is you just have to kind of experiment. Unfortunately, there's not like a protocol that for everybody's going to identify what the issue is. So you've got to experiment and take a look at your race history and what you did at each race. Try and think about, well, when did the issue start to happen? When did nausea start to really bother me? What was I doing up to that point? Is there anything that I can change moving forward that theoretically could alleviate or reduce that problem? And then try that the next time around and see how it goes. I think part of this is also just experience. The more experienced athletes get, the less they tend to have these problems. So it could be the case that they're trying things from race to race and they finally start to have improvements and they ascribe it to something that they did, when it might be just that their body's getting more accustomed to doing ultra races. I think that is almost as equally plausible than anything on the nutrition side. It's experience and race history and your body's capacity to deal with the stress of racing. I think obviously is going to get better over time.
I have a saying, I call it the bike is the buffet. because with cyclists, they tend to be able to tolerate just about anything on the bike versus running. You have to be really particular because that jostling motion it's so much harder for runners and GI issues than it is for cyclists. So there's certainly cyclists that I've seen that have thrown up on the bike and had issues. But yeah, like, is there something to be said about just the motility and the motion that you're making and how that impacts gut issues?
Yeah, it's been long theorized that that's a contributor. I think there's enough anecdotal accounts and evidence to say that, yeah, it's very different. If you look at what elite runners and elite cyclists choose to do and how much they tend to consume during the course of their races, it's certainly different. You do have cases of runners who have done enough gut training where they are able to tolerate similar levels of carbohydrate as like a cyclist in the Tour de France. But on average, you're right that it tends to be a bit less for runners. I think, a big part of it is the jostling, the sloshing around of things in your intestines, and then just the physical damage, the microscopic damage that can cause over the course of, let's say, a marathon or especially an ultra marathon. That doesn't happen to the same extent with a cycling race, because although it has its own stressors, there's not that level of impact that you get as compared to with running. It's kind of equivalent to like muscle damage. You can see muscle damage markers go up more substantially with an ultra marathon than you do with a similar duration cycling race at a similar relative intensity. So you can kind of think almost that jostling and that repetitive impact, what that might be doing to your gut. And it makes sense why there's going to be potentially some more problems that tend to arise with running as compared to with cycling. Now, there are like discipline specific things, like hunched over on a bike in an aero position is going to maybe lead to more upper GI issues in some cases for an athlete if they're in that hunched over aero position, whereas maybe lower symptoms might be more prevalent in runners, especially towards the end of a race or after a race. So there are definitely differences between the modalities. In general, a cyclist is going to be much more able to consume higher amounts if they choose to kind of push the envelope upwards of that, 120 grams per hour or more in some cases. Whether that actually improves performance is not honestly clearly shown, but there are a lot of athletes that believe that and are doing that.
Are there any differences when you're seeing more of the symptoms happening like after exercise versus during, like where they'll get through the workout fine, but then either immediately after or soon after they're having some major issues?
Yeah, the reason why that happens, it's a good question. I think it kind of depends, but one possible explanation is that you just think of like the order of your intestinal tract, and as you progress through a workout and competition, as you get towards the end of that, if you're thinking about nutrients flowing through your intestinal tract and just a start to finish basis, by the time some of those things get to your distal small intestine into your colon, like if you have unabsorbed carbohydrate, for example, that may end up appearing later on in the workout or competition or even afterwards, once those nutrients get into your distal small intestine, your colon, and start to cause some problems there. That's a potential explanation. Sometimes it's like a supplement thing, like sodium bicarb, for example, depending on the form you take it in, whether it's like a beverage, a capsule sort of thing, or the Morton product. It can change when those symptoms tend to appear and how long it takes. So like the beverages, if you just sip on a sodium bicarb beverage, might start to cause problems within the first 15, 30 minutes, whereas the Morton product or even capsules might reduce the symptoms early on, but then you might experience them very close to the end of a race or even afterwards. That's happened to me before, where I used a sodium bicarb supplement, worked perfectly fine before and during, and then afterwards you needed to quickly, get to a Porta-John. This is at a half marathon I did last year. Yeah, it luckily didn't happen during the race, but afterwards, it was sort of a delayed effect. So in that case, it could be, again, an example of the form of a supplement may impact that in terms of the timing of symptoms.
Let's just cover sodium for a second, because I'm noticing a lot more athletes like increasing their sodium level. It tends to be pretty trendy these days with a lot of like electrolyte drink additions. Anything GI related if they are concentrating their fluids too much with sodium and carbs with that possibly?
Yeah, I think both are plausible that if you ingest too much, it can cause problems. Carbohydrate tends to be more of the issue if you're ingesting too much, leading to gastrointestinal problems. But there are some studies even that have shown that at high doses, sodium can cause some GI issues. I think just historically, because carbohydrate has been more clearly linked to performance advantages, people have pushed the boundaries on that, and you're more likely to get symptoms with that, in part because it's been a priority for athletes. Plus, if you don't absorb that carbohydrate, there's a clear mechanistic rationale for why it causes GI symptoms. It's like lactose intolerance, right? If you don't digest it, if you don't absorb it, it sticks in your gut, it gets fermented by bacteria, water can be pulled out into the intestines. So it makes sense why if you're overdoing carbohydrate, you get these GI symptoms. Now that can happen with sodium. If you've got a huge sodium load, you can get water that pulls out from the bloodstream into the lumen or the intestinal space, but you're not going to ferment sodium. So like it's not quite the same as what you get with carbohydrate supplement. Now, at the same time, I think a lot of athletes are needlessly supplementing with sodium in some cases at amounts that aren't doing anything that perhaps are putting them at risk for more gut problems. Most of the science does not say that sodium does anything for performance. The huge caveat to that is most of the studies that have looked at that are pretty short. So I'm not saying that it doesn't. I'm just saying that there's a void of evidence there in proportion to how much some athletes are using it as some sort of ergogenic aid or supplement that they're thinking is going to prevent cramps, also cramps or other issues. I think there's plausibility that it has more benefits in ultra endurance exercise and Ironmans and those situations, but I think a lot of it is marketing for the average athlete, and they don't honestly need as much sodium as they think they do in most cases. But I think there are exceptions to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some very salty sweaters, myself included. If it's a really hot and humid day, if I don't get enough sodium, I have a wicked headache the rest of the day after like a 2-3 hour bike ride. And when if I have like a liquid IV before the workout and make sure I get plenty during, then it's like, yeah, no headache whatsoever. But it's not like I'm looking for it to give me a boost in performance. It's more of like just replenishing my sodium losses from a really an 85-degree 3-hour bike ride.
I agree. I think the way that I use any sort of sodium or electrolyte supplement is either pre-exercise as almost a loading, fluid loading, retain more fluid, or post-exercise, right? Also the same concept, you're more rapidly replenishing and holding on to more of that fluid. So in those circumstances, I think there is good rationale and evidence that it makes some sense under certain circumstances. I think it's the during exercise where athletes sometimes get a little overzealous, and it may, in some limited cases, be contributing to things like nausea, intestinal cramping, those sorts of things, because you've got such a big sodium load in there that it's sort of creating this hypertonic environment in your intestines.
Okay. I wasn't sure if I was going to ask this question up, but I'm just going to throw it out there because this is like a really unique situation. I have had 2 like longer distance athletes where they will race like 5-6 hour races. For what we found, it's both female athletes. For both of them, they've had some situations where towards the end and after the race, they have like a really like bloated, distended abdomen, like where they're like, I almost looked like I was like 4 or 5 months pregnant, where it was like people noticed how significantly distended. And it was a very uncomfortable kind of like gas bloating situation. And the only thing that I could figure out was going on is that they had recently changed their fueling products to a really high maltodextrin based products, and when switched them up to something that offered a little bit more like sucrose, like more dextrose, sucrose, less maltodextrin, not completely eliminating it, that bloating, distension never came back like during a race. Have you seen that at all with people that have like large volumes of maltodextrin, like over like a 5-6 hour period having bloating issues?
Yeah, I think it's possible that if you're consuming and were they consuming maltodextrin sort of exclusively?
The one cyclist for some reason, her coach like switched her to just doing like all maltodextrin for a race, and it like made her bloating significantly worse. And at the same time, I had this other triathlete who had switched to some products that were mostly malto, and formerly she had been using more like Tailwind stuff, which is the sucrose based, and had no issues with that. So I was like, because it was both of them at the same time that had switched to more like heavier doses of maltodextrin, where I was like, I wonder if this is the problem. So then we switched them back, and never in any of their like 5-6 hour workouts or races they had any bloating whatsoever.
Yeah, I suppose if they're, especially if they're ingesting a lot of carbohydrate, I mean, maltodextrin is, change of glucose. So if you're pushing that envelope of over 50 or 60 grams an hour and getting above that,
probably
that's
not getting
really
absorbed and sitting in their gut and, like you said, fermenting.
Yeah, if you're not taking advantage of the sort of different transporters for glucose and fructose, and if you're all relying all on maltodextrin, it's basically meaning you're just ingesting glucose. And if you go above 50 grams an hour with that, some of it is unlikely to get absorbed, and that's going going to cause some of that carbohydrate to be fermented in the gastrointestinal tract if it's not absorbed, because the bacteria there feed on that and they produce gas as a byproduct, which would explain some of the bloating. And it's also possible that some of the chemical modifications that are sometimes made to these maltodextrin products do change some of the digestive properties and symptoms that arise from that. So there are some studies that have tried using modified starch and maltodextrin, and they looked at a host of metabolic changes plus gastrointestinal symptoms. In some cases, it might reduce symptoms. In other cases, you see the opposite. And why that is, it's not entirely clear. But in that scenario that you brought up, to me, that's the first thing that comes to mind, is especially if they're ingesting a lot of it, you're not really taking advantage of the fact that you've got these different transporters in the intestine that you want to kind of use mixed sugars. So sucrose is glucose plus fructose. So, you're taking advantage of that. Yeah. Or a supplement that's got maltodextrin plus fructose would be a good alternative, as opposed to just overdoing it on maltodextrin. I do like maltodextrin as a base for glucose because it, as compared to glucose itself, it has a lower osmolality. When you look at like a maltodextrin drink at a 10% concentration versus a glucose drink at 10% concentration, the osmolality is lower for the maltodextrin products. Yeah. So I like it as a base ingredient, but if it's the only ingredient and you're using too much of it, that could be problematic.
Quick question here. Are there red flags that mean it's time to see a doctor, dietitian, rather than just experimenting on your own?
Yeah, definitely. If you've got, blood in your stool, if you've got chronic symptoms that don't dissipate, outside of the context of exercise, if it's even bothering you to the point where it's interfering with your everyday activities, the way you feel, your mood, those are definitely ones where I would consult with some sort of healthcare provider, whether it's a dietitian at first, or whether it's your family medicine provider or your general practitioner or a gastroenterologist if need be. So those are definitely ones that come to mind. Is anything really severe in terms of pain, persistent in terms of discomfort that's interfering with your mood, your ability to carry out your daily activities. And then, of course, if there's sort of obvious signs of damage, would be blood in your stool or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's definitely something that, if again persistent, you really need to get checked out by somebody else and not just kind of ignore it and think that it's going to go away.
If you could give endurance athletes one golden rule for a happier stomach, what would it be?
I think what I would probably say to that is make sure that when it comes to your nutrition plans for either training or competition, that you do put some time into thinking through it and to trying out those products and those strategies under the conditions under which you expect to compete. Because it's one thing to tolerate something during a moderate intensity training run that's half the duration of what you plan on doing. But I think you do want exposure to those specific products at those specific intervals under the environmental condition and the intensity that you plan to compete at. Now, you obviously can't go do the full race in preparation, but you can at least do those training sessions, some of them at an intensity, and then try and match your expected nutrition plan during those sessions and see how you tolerate it. You may have to make modifications or implement some sort of gut training protocol if you're not able to really successfully tolerate what you're planning to do. Biggest thing is just don't make it a complete afterthought. Put some time into it, especially for an event where you've spent a lot of money and time, to have it be ruined by sort of a careless mistake on the nutrition side. It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Don't wing it, people. Don't wing it.
I've done it before. I've ruined a race by not testing out the things that I was planning to utilize, or just kind of deciding in the middle of the race I was going to do something for whatever reason.
Didn't work out.
No. I mean, it tends to be I'll choose some sort of gel or other product that I'm not used to, or it's more in the context of a certain race, like a half marathon, where I may or may not really need it. And I decide to do it mid-race for, the hopes that it's going to give me something extra. And then what it does is it gives me a side stitch. Don't wing it if possible.
Yeah, love it. Okay. Patrick, where can people learn more from you? Where can they find you? You have a book.
I do, yeah.
Shameless plug here for your book.
So there's that. I mean, if athletes are interested, it's been about 5 years since that was published. So most of it, everything I think in there is still relevant. There's a handful of things that if I were to rewrite the book now would be a bit different. And one of the big things is just the upper end of carbohydrate ingestion.
Yeah.
Historically, 5 years ago, it was more thought that around 90 grams was the top end of what most people can tolerate. And clearly there's a lot of people who are going beyond that. So that would be one thing that would be different. But it's everything else in the book, I would say, is still pretty relevant and current in terms of most of the content.
Yeah.
I'm a faculty member at Old Dominion University. So people can obviously reach out to me via email there if they want to ask me questions or anything like that. I am on social media to a limited degree. I'm not an influencer. I don't have the time for it. I do occasionally record some YouTube videos on topics like this, but hard to be consistent with that as much as I like when, research and teaching are kind of the priorities. So,
yeah.
But I do have a YouTube channel. I don't think I could tell you off the top of my head what the actual channel is.
I'll find it. I'll put it in the show notes. We'll put it in
the show notes because it's not committed to memory for me.
Love it. Well, and you're a dad, like you got a lot going on. So I completely understand that. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for your time today. This is amazing. I'm really excited. I don't know if you feel this way. I'm excited to see where the research continues to go in terms of like learning more about endurance nutrition, especially like learning more about GI issues and how we can continue to support athletes.
Yeah. And that's something that, my lab does a bit of. It's a focus of some of my research, obviously. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff still to be learned about, whether it be sports products, nutrition supplements, training approaches in terms of gut training, how all those things impact the GI system. There's still a lot to be learned. So yeah, I'm excited as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for what you do. And thanks for being here today.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure to be on the podcast.
Thanks again to Dr. Wilson for sharing his time and wisdom today. If this episode made you laugh, cringe, or flashback to your own porta potty horror stories, then we did our job. Share this one with your training buddies so you can both avoid that code brown in your next workout. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast. And if you share on social media, please tag me at Alex Larson Nutrition so that I can say hi. Until next time, fuel smart, run strong, and may all your bathroom stops be optional.